It's a real pleasure to have you here for this lunchtime event on the view from European capitals. I'm Jill Rutter, I'm Programme Director for Brexit here at the Institute. Too often Brexit seems to be a rather preoccupying British discussion. So we thought that in the run-up to the European Council, which may or may not be critical, depending on quite how good that dinner was last night, it would be really useful for people here to get an appreciation from the view from other really important European capitals of actually how might they be seeing not just what might happen in 2 days' time, but how the next months and years might unfold. And I think also, interestingly, just how important is Brexit in their current political debate. So I was looking at various of the front pages of the newspapers and outlets for which our panel are responsible yesterday, and what was very significant to me was there was an awful lot about Catalonia, there was a lot about the Wunderwutzi in Austria, but no mention of Brexit. So Pablo did file something about Theresa May's attempt to unblock the negotiations, but he didn't quite make it to the front page, given so much is going on in Spain at the moment. So just to introduce our panel, from my far right, have Jacqueline Miner. Jacqueline was head of the UK representation for the European Commission, but I should stress she was head of that and is speaking here very much in a personal capacity. So she'll give us some insights into the Commission view, but she is definitively not speaking for the Commission. Pablo Guimón is the correspondent for Pais, which you'll know, leading Spanish newspaper. Pablo's been in the UK for 3 years. Joining us, and hot off the Eurostar from Brussels, is Christine, from Paris. It's Christine Ockrent from France Culture, and Christine is a leading broadcaster, journalist, doyenne of the art. And finally, on my far left, is Stefanie Bolzen. Stefanie is UK correspondent of Die Welt, which, for those of you who don't know, is a leading German newspaper. So we have some of the representation from major things. The way we're going to do this is no formal presentations. I'm going to start off with 1 or 2 questions to our panel. We'll then go to you for your questions and make it a very interactive discussion, and aim to finish. There's huge amounts of energy in the room by 1:45, so you can all get back to preparing for what's going to go on for the rest of the week. So I'm just going to start off with the perceptions all of you have on the Council. We heard that the UK was very hopeful that by appealing around the Commission or over the head of the Commission, that actually this was the way to unblock progress, that this sort of battery of phone calls to Monsieur Macron, Frau Merkel and whatever was going to unlock things, and that actually it was the Commission that was blockage, but if only we could talk to the Member States it would all come out very easily. So I just wondered how that felt, because that doesn't seem to have been perhaps the best judgment of strategy. Stefanie, do you want to kick off? And what's the German perspective on the charm offensive that has been launched the last few days to try and move things on?
Not very impressed, I think, so far. I think the kind of conclusion or the statement last night after the dinner was we should accelerate negotiations, whatever that means, because how can you accelerate if you can't agree? So my impression is ahead of the Council, and the big question is whether this continues after this Council. What is accelerating are kind of 2 trains driving in directions they shouldn't, and there's a kind of car crash that is on the horizon. Well, hopefully not, but talking to people in Berlin, there is, of course, it's as everybody expected, it's down to the money now. And there is a certain robustness in both positions, I think. You find a lot of robust wordings here, and almost kind of, stroppiness about why are they not listening and why do they not want to agree. And the same you find increasingly in Berlin. So that very last and very thin sentence of these conclusions about informal preparation talks is even thinner than it could have been. So that was because of German and, as far as I know, French influence.
So Christine, Monsieur Macron was or the French government was allegedly behind the original strengthening of some of the demands on money. Mrs. May called Monsieur Macron, we are told, on Sunday. We don't know what that is. So are the French absolutely aligned with the Germans that it's all about the money at this stage, or what more is needed to deem there to be sufficient progress and move on to stage 2, which is after all what the British government's keen to do?
I think from a Paris perspective, it's about having any idea of what a coherent British strategy might be. And so, frankly, the fact that your Prime Minister called Monsieur Macron, I don't think it makes any difference. The idea of trying to play bilaterals to try and skirt around the Commission, I mean, it's an old game within the EU, of course, that each member state plays at one stage or the other. But unfortunately, and I think it's true also in Berlin, we have a long memory of Great Britain with usually more talent, I'm sorry to say, plays double tricks, trying to do this and then doing the reverse. So I don't think it works at all. And another dimension, which I think is totally absent from the perception here, is that the French Élysée is not at all that much interested in the extricacies of the Tory party. And in spite of the rather picturesque characters around, I think there's more seriously an underestimation of the Prime Minister's difficulties in handling her own government and beyond that, her own majority. And so whatever is taken here as a step forward is really not considered that way at all on the other side of the channel.
So was France not very impressed with the Florence speech? Prime Minister went there, spoke to a lot of British journalists and the cabinet in Florence, but...
nice speech, but then if speeches were policies, France would have been reformed decades ago.
Okay, some wise words perhaps for your president as well. Pablo, is there any bandwidth in Spain to bother about this? I mean, you obviously have rather preoccupying events in Catalonia and stuff like that, so is your government paying any attention to this, or what is going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I will say it's not obviously number one priority now, and not for the last weeks, not since the Florence speech, but I mean, it is a very I mean, it's no secret that the relationship between Spain and the UK is very, very special. No, not only in the most obvious ways, like the almost probably 1 million Britons living part of the year at least in Spain, or the probably 300,000 Spaniards living here, but also the 1 in every 4 tourists that go to Spain are British. Britain is the first direct investment market, I think, from Spain. No? So there's a lot at stake, and yeah, I mean, I think that Spain represents a thing that we can see now in the EU, that Spain is very interested in a soft Brexit. They don't want to press they would not want to press too much. They would not like to go too far and to risk a no deal, but they stick to the consensus, which I think is one of the shocking things we've seen in the EU these days. No, that many people might have a special interest in the negotiations, many countries, but they all stick to the consensus, which is quite. So that's why also, going back to your earlier question, I don't think that has worked, and probably it will work to try the bilateral way and to try to address leaders and not the Commission.
So how will, Jacqueline, how will this attempt to sort of, as people on this side were saying, skirt round the process that the 27 had agreed and endorsed, how will that have played out in the Commission? It was slightly emerging as some of our better friends in this, perhaps.
Well, not well, I think. There is a process which was made clear at the outset of negotiations, and the Commission will expect the UK to honour that process to which it has agreed. I think the Florence speech was well received in Brussels. It was constructive in its tone and its tenor, but as my grandmother might have put it, fine words better no parsnips. And I think there will have been an expectation that the speech will have been followed by a more detailed commitment in terms of both the citizens and the money issues. And clearly that didn't happen in the negotiating round that has since taken place. So, and that will have been a disappointment. Nevertheless, I think the Commission clearly wants the process to succeed. Barnier has said time and time again that he is looking to achieve a deal, and he will want, I think, also to prepare, as he and his team have clearly prepared for this first phase, for the next phases of negotiation. And you need to prepare ahead of beginning the negotiation on the scope of the future relationship and of transition. But I think the problem with talking about transition is, again, as Barnier has said, you need to know what one is transitioning to. And the UK has not yet been very clear about what it wants from the future relationship, apart from it being deep and special and inventive and imaginative.
Okay. So in terms of the transition, I mean, is that the perception in Berlin and Paris as well, that you can't really have a serious discussion on transition, or as the Prime Minister likes to call it, implementation phase, until at the very least you've got the principles of the future end-state relationship agreed? So rather than just have I think Pascal Lamy here said a sort of continuity clause that would give you the sort of breathing space to sort these things out. And how far does stage 2 have to go before a transition can be agreed, do you think? Do you have a view?
Well, to have a transition, again, as colleague just said, you have to know where is the transition going to. And the current impression in Berlin is that no one knows, obviously, here, or the government doesn't know what it wants. It is constantly looking at domestic issues and mainly at the issues and interests and infighting in the Tory party, and that they try to, as someone put it, they try to cover their lack of orientation by getting very robust. And that's something that obviously, if you look at the agenda of the European Council, Brexit is one of the very last things. So that tells you that there is a lack of time and a lack of interest, and that is only harming the UK's interests, and also the fact that the lack of orientation has a very, very, very severe consequence, which is losing time. So the clock is ticking, and the more squabbling about what it could be, and actually kind of the expectation that actually the other side has to deliver the solution, this is only a waste of time in this, seeing it from the continent.
So Pablo said that Spain ultimately was in the soft Brexit camp. Where would Germany be? Does Germany have a view on a preferred Brexit?
Well, obviously they're interested in the best deal for themselves as well, which would be a soft Brexit. There's no question.
Okay. Christine, how's transition and the sort of Brexit playing out in France?
Well, I think, again, I fully subscribe to what has been said by our German friend. It's like wanting to build a house when you're getting a divorce and you don't even agree on the terms of the divorce. So it's not, I mean, this attempt to always find the right adjective, you know, should it be soft, medium, whatever. I think we all agree that it would be nice and smooth and very positive for Europe as a whole that indeed this crazy process comes to terms in the most positive way for all parties concerned. But again, I'm afraid it's a British issue and a British quagmire rather than a continental one. And so, of course, let's have a soft Brexit. But let's first try and find out what this government and this Parliament are set to do.
So one of the UK's perceptions, quite interesting, Pablo mentioned the sort of 1 million British people who live in Spain, businesses who depend on amicable relations. And one of the sort of British hopes has been that over time, business will come in to pressure governments over in the continent to say, well, actually, we need to get on. We want certainty too. It's not just the CBI and the Institute of Directors in the UK who want to know where we're going, actually, to put a bit of pressure on it. And we saw the, I think, joint démarche with Bund der Deutschen Arbeitgeber a few weeks ago saying, let's move to trade talks together with I think the CBI, with the British Chambers of Commerce. Is there any manifestation of domestic pressure that, we're just all spending ages sort of dancing around on pinheads about this and that and talking about money and stuff like that, and actually what really matters is getting into that? Or is that just not materialising at all yet?
Oh, we're very much hoping more British banks, more British companies, more foreign residents here in London move to France. Not to mention the 3 European agencies that are established here in London. So whenever there is such a move, whenever Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan says, oh, we're going to reinforce our French establishment, we rejoice, of course. I mean, it's good for France, and it's one, I think, of the differences in timing that, of course, we journalists, we're always, very short term. But it seems that this government is so long-term that it doesn't accommodate for medium-term interests of business. And of course, each country, and I guess Germany, Spain, I mean, we're all trying to get, the best bits and pieces and take advantage of, indeed, the serious worries of business. The fact that EasyJet would go to Vienna, the fact that Lloyd's would move out of London, I mean, that was just extraordinary. And so, of course, we're all competing and offering the best conditions.
The other way around, of course, there are massive German interests in having a good deal, and there are, as you say,
a good deal, of course.
But there have been calls to move quicker. But there have been the minorities. The big majority is saying, basically, the call goes directly to the British government, saying, get your act together, basically pay up. Get the first part, the 3 issues, as far as you can sorted, and then I'm sure there will be a growing pressure or lobbying by the German industry on the German government to get a good deal, a very soft deal too, because I think it's something like 800,000 jobs on both sides that depend indirectly on British-German trade relations. So there is a massive interest there. But first of all, you have to solve the situation there, and then you can start looking at what you can get out of it.
So Pablo, do you think that the interest in Spain, which clearly quite sort of distinctive as you were setting out, do you think they're likely to increase if we look as though we're moving into early to mid 2018 without much prospect of getting to a good solution?
Yeah, I mean, there are many. It's not only the businesses in this case, which is very important. We have very important Spanish companies operating here, but also the pressure from the citizens, from the Spanish citizens living here and the other way around. There were some papers leaked by the Spanish government. From the Spanish government preparing on deals, on bilateral deals and everything. But as I said before, I think there's a huge discipline and a huge effort and knowledge that only being united and being one only voice in Europe, this will succeed.
So Jacqueline, we saw that the sort of the council conclusions as potentially slightly sort of watered down, with the Commission sort of seeking a bit of a mandate to go to phase 2 to start the preparatory work. How long does that actually require before the whole process of getting a mandate for phase 2? Even if they had the sort of blue touch paper lit on Friday, how quickly could they actually get their act together to be ready to talk to?
Well, I think as I said before, part of the problem is not knowing what the UK is actually asking for. If the UK is asking for a bespoke deal, which apparently it is, it takes longer than, say, an off-the-shelf status, which is already there, something like the EEA, plus or minus or squared, or CETA. I know that the British government continually emphasises that they are starting from a very good place in this negotiation, because they're starting from a position of absolute alignment. But surely part of the rationale of Brexit is that complete alignment will dissipate over time. Otherwise, what is the point? And therefore you have to put into place mechanisms to deal with the change in the UK status and the potential change in UK regulation. And I think it's those mechanisms, in the light of a trading partner who is so close geographically, so important economically, which will have to be quite innovative. I don't think you can simply say, well, we can transpose the South Korean deal, or we can transpose CETA, because geographically, economically, culturally, it's an entirely different situation.
So Politico this morning reported that the UK was looking for a Switzerland-style deal. Do you think that's on the cards?
No.
Okay.
That's a personal view. I think, Switzerland would not be offered a Switzerland-style deal if it were to start the process all over again. It has a lot of drawbacks, the Swiss-style deal, the domino effect, so that if you breach one part of the agreement, all the other parts of the agreement are theoretically also rendered non-applicable. It is very cumbersome in procedural terms, because there's no automatic adaptation to changes within the EU, so everything has to be reopened and negotiated again. And even the UK, well before the referendum, signed up, I think, to some council conclusions which invited the Commission to look again at the way the Swiss deal was working, because all 28 member states at that point were dissatisfied with the way it worked.
Okay, that was then, this is now. Let's go to questions from the audience. I think we've got some mics, so I'm going to take them in batches. So we will go right to the back. If anyone is in the overspill room and wants to ask a question, they'll need to just put their head round the door. So right to the back. Yeah.
It's a question for Pablo. Pablo, my name's Ray Taylor from PwC. Do you think Spain will use this negotiation, particularly the negotiation on future arrangements, as leverage to try and get some solution on the Gibraltar question?
Okay, well, that's a very bespoke question, since bespoke is now the word, with a very bespoke respondent. So we're all slightly, were we taken aback when we noticed Gibraltar's mention in the guidelines, the sort of Spanish influence? So is it a stumbling block down the line?
I really don't think so. The Gibraltar issue, it's not going to be a problem in the negotiation, because what the paper says is after the withdrawal agreement. No? So any mention after in the future relationship, any mention of Gibraltar should be agreed by Spain. I don't think it's going to be I don't think it's a priority. It was like a kind of victory, interpreted like a kind of diplomatic victory for Spain in that sense, and it was surprising that there was so unanimously backed, and I think that's it. I don't think it's going to be unless there's some I don't know, any particular issue that could change dramatically the status quo, or just I don't know, I don't think there's a political will of creating a huge problem where there is not such a huge problem now. No?
I think that's the first bit of good news we've had on the negotiations today.
I don't know.
So let's go just in front, and then we will take them in a three, so we come over there,
You're all quite glum. I just want to take you back to Jill's opening statement about the British tactics or strategy of divide and rule, and refer you back to the title of European capitals. Do any of your colleagues here representing other newspapers or in Paris and other capitals give different views of different governments. I'm thinking of Poland, Italy, and smaller countries vis-à-vis Brexit.
Okay, let's go down here.
Thank you. My name's Simon Sapper. I'm from the Makes You Think consultancy. Simple question: to what extent do the panel believe that a no-exit Brexit is likely?
Okay, and let's just go over there quickly. Yep, thanks.
Thank you. Tamsin Cooper, Green Alliance. To what extent does the panel think that member state governments will be supportive of an environmental red line being part of a condition of a future deal?
Okay, that's a sort of variety of questions. So have we just got the wrong countries here and we're getting a sort of false perspective? We did pick quite big ones because obviously QMV matters on the final deal. So I think between you must have quite a lot of votes in the council. But is there, if we, got Poles, Hungarians, Maltese, Italians, would we be getting a very different perspective? Do you get that sense from your
colleagues? I was actually reflecting on the same question before,
Yeah.
because we probably should have someone from Poland here as well, and I would be very intrigued to know what they actually did, the 8 foreign ministers with Boris Johnson this weekend, and why those 8 foreign ministers. And you can already now see splits about the Danes and the Dutch who want to move forward onto trade talks, and different interests, of course. I do think, though, that on the first phase they are united, and this unity is not breaking apart. I don't think so, because in the end they all want the money. So why would they give in here? But so it's for the UK to move on this point.
Does anyone disagree with this point that there would be a slight? Because I think it is interesting if we saw that sort of moment that the Danish finance minister slightly said, can't we just get on with this? And we had the same experience at an event I was talking about at the Conservative Party conference. The Swedish ambassador came in when I was talking about the integrity of the 27. He said, no, we want a deal, which I thought was quite interesting. But I just wonder whether there were sort of signs of people peeling off a bit. And
I think everyone wants a deal. That's undoubtedly the case. There's nobody hanging out for a hard Brexit. But I think the unity of the 27 has been striking, and it's easy to be unified around the first 3 points. And therefore, in a way, it's harder for there to be continuing unity as you move on. But so far it's held, and I think there will be differences of emphasis probably when they come to talk about the nature of the future relationship. But I still think that it's in everybody's interest to get a deal, both about the withdrawal and the future relationship. This is lose-lose for everybody in any event. The question is mitigating those losses, and the best way to do that is by getting an agreed outcome.
so when we hear Michel Barnier talk, going to Tamsin's question, when we hear Michel Barnier talks, he clearly puts a lot of emphasis on the dangers. You mentioned it, Jacqueline, a bit about having this big country next to you, maybe not playing by the same rules. So how much is actually the UK continuing to observe, whether it's the letter of the sort of whole acquis on things like the environment, how much is that going to be a demand from Europe, do you think?
That's written into the original mandate. If you look at the original mandate, when it talks about the future relationship, it says, subject to the United Kingdom respecting environmental competition. There's a whole range of descriptors, and I think that is something that is embedded there. The 27, understandably, would not want to have Singapore on steroids sitting off its northwestern coast.
But I mean, that doesn't feature in CETA really at all. CETA has some quite sort of feeble provisions about respecting whatever. Yeah. Barnier has offered the choice of CETA. He said you can go for CETA if you want, you can go for EEA if you want. Slightly suggests there's nothing in between, but anyway.
He may have said that. I mean, it'd be interesting to see where the negotiations get to subsequently. The extent to which, in addition to the strict trade arrangements within any deal, there will be an insistence upon flanking measures is, I think, one of the big issues that has yet really to be resolved.
Okay, so no deal. If you were talking Berlin, Paris, Madrid, where do they think the chances of no deal are now sitting? Pablo?
Well, I mean, I don't know exactly the position in Madrid, but my own position is that it can. I mean, it can happen, and at some kind of no deal. No? I mean, probably. I mean, it's not going anywhere, no, and it's not, and the clock is ticking, and it's really difficult. There's some issues that are really difficult to solve, and in 1 year is nothing, and I don't know. I mean, what happens in? Let's see what happens in the next couple of weeks. But if it doesn't advance, I see that the UK will say, okay, that's
So
all we can.
what does Spain make of the sort of, stumbling blocks in the withdrawal agreement? So the money, where Spain isn't one of the biggest net contributors, it's also not one of the biggest recipients. Now we've got the A8 and things like that. And on citizens' rights, I mean, is it really going to go down to the wire on ECJ, which seems to be the biggest?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the red lines, let's say, of Spain would be the same as the rest. I think ECJ, but for the citizens, the ECJ would, in a way, would be a red line, and I mean, the money issue in the Florence speech, it was just the budget. The budget commitments, no. So it's probably not. It has to go a little bit further, no. I mean, they could be easier on. I mean, they will understand that Ireland is not something that you can solve in the preliminary phase. That I think everybody will agree. But the other two issues, the money and the citizens, yeah.
So what about Berlin and Paris? Where are you on no deal?
I think maybe it's naive, but they in Berlin, thinking goes that there is enough common sense to not risk a no deal scenario, and that if it comes to Brussels, in the end they always find a deal somehow at every summit, and if they have to spend 2 or 3 nights with sandwiches in the council. But there's more worry if the no deals is unilateral from here because of pressure in the Tory party. That's another scenario for no deal, I guess.
So we think that the person who would sort of avoid the no deal at the end of the day would be Frau Merkel, that she would be the person who would ride to the rescue and sort all these people out, because she is, after all, the queen of pragmatism and common sense. Is she powerful enough to do that? Is she interested enough in doing that?
Obviously, that depends again on what kind of coalition we will see being formed in Germany, but whatever coalition it is, and it's very likely to be a coalition with the Greens and the FDP with the Liberals, that doesn't really change the German government's policy. There's no difference. They are all pro-European. The FDP is maybe more pro-business, and the Greens are more pro-human rights or whatever. It's not important in that context. But I think there's not much of a difference. And you are right. If you look at Merkel's biography, she has 12 years going to European councils and being at councils that were really existential, like the ones on Greece in 2010. But of course, she needs to be careful that in the end of the day, being back home, she doesn't get blamed for now Germany is paying the bill again. So it's a very, it's a lot of forces she has to manage in that very moment.
And if Mrs. May had, rather than in Florence, just offered, as Pablo said, we'll see you right during the transition and we'll continue contributing, so don't worry about the hole in that budget period. But if Mrs. May had put a figure on it, is there a figure she could have put on the table which Germany would have said, yeah, okay, that's fine, we'll move on? No.
Well, if it's fulfilling what the EU 27 is asking for, but they didn't. So it's far less.
Yeah. So
it's not a bilateral discussion.
No, it's far less. I mean, it's and plus, I think there is for years now an impatience in Berlin with the British government, starting with Cameron and now with Theresa May. There's really impatience. So no, we're not playing games anymore.
Okay.
If I may just add, I think now there is a very close alliance beyond the usual speech about the Franco-German engine, quote unquote. I think there is indeed a strong alliance between Madame Merkel and Emmanuel Macron. And it's very interesting that in Macron's speech in the Sorbonne, first of all, let me remind you that Macron is the first French politician ever to have been elected as a pro-European with a rather precise pro-European platform. So I think it's very important in the chemistry which is developing within the 27. In his last long European speech in the Sorbonne, he did extend a hand to Great Britain. Again, we don't want Britain to be out. Unfortunately, there was that referendum. We have a lot of bad experiences with referendum, so we know what it entails. But again, Macron did say, if Britain wants to come back, we're open. And so I think this idea that a no deal would be the wish. And to answer an interesting point that this gentleman raised, in the French media, for instance, you have however contrasted their political views may be, you have no real diversity of opinions about Brexit, and there's very little coverage, by the way, of Brexit. Very little. It's not on the front page.
That's very. I'm just interested in the Macron Sorbonne speech, which was very long, very detailed, very sort of visionary compared to a lot of things we get from
difficult
politicians
to translate,
here.
I guess.
There was a very helpful 2-page English summary that they put out, so maybe they didn't want to translate the entire thing into English, which was quite useful. But he did talk about this sort of UK could rejoin a sort of reformed outer rim of Europe, and I just wondered whether there was a sort of any sort of thinking in Paris that actually maybe the sort of relationship, association agreement, the British words deep, special, imaginative, flexible, whatever relationship we have actually would be the first member of that new sort of constellation of is it definitely an out then back in, or is it we're moving to a different sort of relationship, and actually other people may want to have that relationship with the EU too, that we might be a model of a new sort of relationship with the EU?
Well, I mean, if it were to be a model, we should know more about, again, what the British strategy is and what this government's and this parliament's views are. It's very difficult to imagine, the phase after the next phase after the next phase without having any concrete ideas of what's coming out.
Excellent.
Next.
More questions? Yes. So go there, and then come forward there.
Rosaline Hughes. If the negotiations were to continue to go badly and there was a British political crisis and the House of Commons were to decide that it didn't like the deal and voted it down and voted to rescind Article 50, what would be the attitude of your governments and the Commission to that? And how near the 11th hour could it happen?
Okay, let's think about that and then we'll go there, yes.
Anne Perkins from The Guardian. I'm just really perplexed by this bill. And
the bill as in the money, as opposed to the legislation.
As in the money, as in the money, as in the not the legislation. Yeah. And last week we were told that it hadn't even been agreed how the sums were to be calculated, and I can't believe we've seen no workings from the Commission about exactly how they're calculating this or where the areas for negotiation are. So I think it's a little bit tough to blame the UK for failing to step up to the mark on this one.
Okay, and let's go down here. Yes.
Thank you very much. It's Masato Kimura, Japanese journalist. I don't think it's not only distance, but also culture and legal system. And so, if no deal, what about as alternative TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership? Because there are some countries in Commonwealth, and also including Japan. Japan's ambassador here was a tough negotiator, TPP, and so it's a good chance for UK forward-looking thinking.
I'm not sure that our panel can answer whether the UK should join the TPP as opposed to just sort of try and mirror the EU-Japan agreement and do it, which I think is what the Prime Minister assured your Prime Minister that we would try to do when she was out in Tokyo.
President Trump had cancelled TPP.
No, other people are in TPP. It's not just it can survive without the Americans. It can survive without the Americans. So let's go to, I'm giving you a bit more time to think about Rosaline's point about rescission, which is obviously very live following some of the things that Keir Starmer and Ken Clarke were saying at the weekend. So what more precision do we need on the bill, and why is nobody actually there isn't a figure from the Commission. I mean, we have that long list, and we were told that after the French and Polish interventions, the long list described by a former UK senior official as a kitchen sink from the Commission. I think that everything that moved went into it. Actually, could the Commission put a figure onto that? Why can't we just sort of agree a methodology or something like that?
The Commission says they don't want to put any figure on this for the time being, because they will only know the figure once everything is agreed. But I think there are 2 points here. This is the overall figure at the end, because that depends on your future relationship and the status and what kind of payments the UK might still do. But if we talk about, we are now talking only about the first part, and this is, at least from a German perspective, is that the UK should pay commitments they have made in the past. And the UK for now is saying, okay, we're gonna pay into the MFF, so the budget until 19 and 20. But Germans are saying, hold on, you're also committed to pensions, and lots of pensions of Brussels civil servants, also British civil servants. Why should the Germans now pay the British civil servants? You have committed to that, and then also things that go beyond the MFF, which is, I think, mainly commitments to the Ukraine and I think to one other country for long-time projects. So you can't say, well, we committed to that, but actually now we're not interested anymore by. So this is why this is two different things here.
Now, I think that Ukraine is contingent liabilities, so I think it's only if loans to the Ukraine go bad that there's money that you crystallise. That's a bit of provisioning Ukraine. Anyone, what do you think on the
I think the
bill?
Commission has been fairly detailed about the items and the methodology that would lead to a calculation. And indeed, we were told, I think at the last but one round, that the British side had spent the entire time going through the Commission's position point by point and challenging it. So I think the Commission has been very clear with the British side how it intends to calculate the figure. But I think the failure to give a figure was intended to facilitate agreement rather than the opposite, in that it's better to agree a methodology and then apply the methodology than to start haggling simply about numbers. And in any case, it's impossible to determine the final figure until you get to the date of Brexit and you know what liabilities continue to exist at that point. The Commission always commits more funds, nearly always commits more funds to a project than are actually spent on that project. So you have entries on the so-called commitment line, the credit card line, which then prove to be, to have a margin of error, and that will bring down the actual payments. So I think the idea was methodology is less controversial, less sensitive, and easier to agree upon than numbers. But perhaps that was a wrong assumption.
So let's go on to this rescission point. So, government can't get its legislation through, Parliament gets a vote on something and sends the government back and says, rescind Article 50. So the UK government in a year's time or so comes and says, this was all a horrible mistake. We take it back, that letter, we never really wrote it, and whatever. So this question was asked here a year ago to, I think, a former head of Commission Legal Service. He said, actually, ultimately, because there's a big debate about is it a legal question or a political question. He said, ultimately, it's a political question. It will go down to the politics in the Council and whether the Council was prepared to agree to a UK coming back. If we did that, Pablo, what would Spain think if the UK offer to come back?
I don't know. I mean,
Asked to come back.
first of all, I think the speed of developments makes it very difficult to know what would happen in 1 year time. No? If you look at the 6 past months, no? I begin to think that I mean it's possible for that to happen. No? I mean, especially for the I mean. For the British side, no, they imagine there's no that the deal agreed isn't satisfactory. There's the parliament doesn't pass. There's an election, so many things can happen. But I don't know. A proper getting back to the EU would be very difficult. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense to continue with this project with a partner that has gone now. I don't know. I think everything should be on the table and everything is possible, but it's very difficult to have a proper.
UK grovelling back? Stefanie?
I don't know. I wonder whether the UK would ever do that. I mean, isn't that humiliating for a nation to say, well, actually, we've done this now for 2 years, and now we turn back and say, it was not a good idea, so I can't really imagine. And then, of course, it's then a question of political will. And everybody would agree, let them stay because it's all much easier. But as Pablo said, it's been a very difficult 2 years. It's been a lot of scars there. Is that going to work?
So I think the suggestion when we were discussing this last year was that the EU would maybe make us lose some of our opt-outs, maybe ask us to sort of pay off the cost of the negotiations and the time and effort, so Monsieur Barnier's salaries and stuff like that, his team, and that, but actually, because this would be a sense of reinforcing the European project rather than Brexit undermining it, it actually wouldn't necessarily be that unwelcome to the 27.
First of all, we would applaud the strength of British democracy, the strength of your parliamentary system, the referendum again being another process. But indeed, it's again a British issue. I think overall, we'd all rejoice at the idea that Great Britain gets back in. I mean, nobody wanted Great Britain out. So if indeed your parliamentary process is such that such another cataclysm happens, we'd have to stay put and see what the political process becomes, going against a referendum which is supposed to actually reflect what the people want. But I think, again, primarily, it would be a British problem again, I'm afraid.
Okay, so we've got some more questions down at the front. So let's go, lady here.
Hello, Carol Walker. Everyone keeps talking about a deal and how both sides want a deal, but I was also just interested in what Stefanie was saying, which was about the EU's tradition of finding some sort of fudge compromise. Given the snail's pace of the negotiations so far, I wonder whether we're heading towards a scenario whereby we're fast approaching March 2019. There's no prospect of getting everything agreed. And so you then end up with a series of little bitty arrangements so that you sort out so the planes can fly and so that there's something to oversee nuclear energy. But essentially you then use a transition period to try to sort out all those complex customs arrangements and whether that is a scenario that we could end up with.
Okay, so no deal, but some deals. Yes, let's go to John and then we'll go behind. Yeah, Dave, and then behind. Whichever.
Well, I wanted to go out to one of the previous answers. I wonder how far capitals are influenced by the feeling that Theresa May is very weak after the election, that her cabinet is very split, and that there's therefore no point negotiating with her because she might not be there in a year's time.
Okay, and behind.
Thanks. My name is John Cartledge Oates. There was an earlier question about green and environmental issues, which you didn't put to the panel, so perhaps in fairness to that question, you need to come back to that. But the question I'd like to ask is a slightly more fundamental one. Presumably, if you're negotiating Brexit, the attitude you take depends on whether or not you think on balance it's a desirable or undesirable outcome. And Christine suggested that as far as the EU27 is concerned, it's something that nobody wanted. Can you help me to understand why that is? Because my perception from this side of the channel is that British were always the odd ones out. They were never the team players. They never joined Schengen. They never joined the Euro. They banged their handbag and boycotted the meetings until they got half their subscription paid back. They insist that everybody else speaks their language because they don't speak anybody else's. They're always the member that doesn't fit. And I would have thought that from your point of view, you'd be heartily glad to be rid of us. What is it that makes you want to keep? Is it just the money we pay in as a net contributor, or is there actually something else that makes you like us?
That's a very interesting. Let's go to let's start in sort of escalating order. Actually, I did think we answered the environmental question because that's all part of the single market acquis, is all those environmental rules and stuff like that. So I thought we did answer it, that Barnier would insist on it, and that was part of what the Europe wanted. So sorry if that was a bit unclear. Tamsin looked happy at any rate. This point about, at the end, I think we've done some work that says no major country trades with the EU on WTO terms alone, even if they don't have a free trade agreement. Lots don't have free trade agreements. They have customs facilitation, data sharing, aviation, So wouldn't we have some sort of sticking plaster deals, at least to mitigate the sort of, biggest, most disruptive elements? Would there be any appetite for that in the 27 if its clock is ticking and we needed to just say, in both interests, we don't want complete dislocation?
I mean, the consensus is, of course, that you at the end of next year, you must have a deal that is a very broad deal. You can't go into the details. It's impossible, and therefore I think the next 3 months until the December Council, they are crunch time. So something really has now to move forward, because then the time just gets too short. You have only a couple of months left, and then you need to go into the ratification in the parliaments, in the national parliaments, if they ratify. And I think the biggest hurdle in the end will be the European Parliament and the British Parliament. So it's just zero. It gets more and more difficult. But then at the end, if you you should hope by on the 29th of March 2019, you have a very broad deal on which you can then go ahead.
Okay, any other views on these sort of...
I think no deal, in some respects, will have symmetrical effects. So the 27 will have to increase their customs capacity. They'll have to build around their ports, just in the same way that the UK will have to build around its ports. But in many respects, it's asymmetric. The 27 will not have to create new agencies. The 27 will not have to renegotiate free trade agreements. So no deal creates far more things for the UK to have to deal with and address than it will for the EU27. It was interesting, I think, that at the weekend it's beginning to emerge that no deal doesn't actually mean no deal. No deal means no big deal, but a series of little arrangements to make sure that the planes carry on flying and the port of Dover doesn't close for 2 weeks to try and work out what it's got to do next. Whether that's feasible or not, I think is a big question. And if you're tying up all these little arrangements, what are you doing them for? Are you doing them to enable Article 50 actually to be extended? And Article 50 only allows the time limit to be extended by unanimity. It would only take one member state to say, this is an abusive procedure. You haven't extended Article 50 unanimously, but you have de facto sought to continue the discussion after the deadline. Or the European Parliament challenged that, as was pointed out. And the whole edifice then comes tumbling down again.
So what about this view that there's no point wasting our time on the current government? They're hopelessly divided. Theresa May's potentially a transient prime minister. I don't know whether you went to she didn't have the greatest ever party conference. She's living on borrowed time, so actually is it worth devoting that much time and effort when we've got loads of more pressing things? We're negotiating a coalition, we're setting out grand vision, trying to reform France finally, and we're trying to deal with secession in the richest part of our country. So they're quite big other preoccupations that might lead you to sort of rather downgrade focusing on dealing with the UK. I mean, is that how it seems, or?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think that's a huge issue, no? I mean, and people in the capitals perceive it like that. I mean, obviously, Theresa May is lacking now the authority to go further, no? And in her own country, I mean, in her own party, in her own country, everything, no? So I think people in the other parts are aware of that, and that's certainly something important. But as you said, all the countries have this kind of problems in some way. No?
What about France? In France, do you think there's a perception that?
No, there's certainly a perception that this is a very weak Prime Minister, and let's hope that the forthcoming European Council doesn't turn into a humiliating exercise for her. As indeed we remember previous councils.
Is there any sense that she's the best you're going to get? And actually, if you sort of look at the potential alternative prime ministers, actually Europe, if you want the best outcome for both the UK and Europe, that actually not undermine, not going out of your way to humiliate Mrs May, to let her appear to emerge with a sliver of triumph or whatever, would actually help this process.
But again, we haven't discovered yet all the extraordinary diversity of your political personnel. But I think there's enough of a perception of the very particular political circumstances that you are going through, and the fact that Labour doesn't make any clear position known either about Brexit, doesn't simplify things. But we're not in a game of we are, of course, in a political theatre, but that's not really the crux of the matter. And I think that the Council has many other major issues on the agenda. As always, they're cramming it up. And so if they also have to talk about refugees, if they also have to talk about defence, and God knows what else is actually on the table, I think the Brexit issue may be dismissed quite quickly, saying, okay, Prime Minister, so what is it exactly that you want? And again, I'm always struck coming to London or being asked by some wonderful BBC researchers or journalists to comment about Brexit issues. It's like, of course there's the channel, but it's like we live on different planets, which is very much what Jean-Claude Juncker said at the very start, and it's only getting more so, I feel, that indeed on the continent we have many other preoccupations, but there's also an incremental process within the EU, which Brexit has helped forge, which I think is totally underestimated here on the other side of the channel. I think there are more scenarios to revamp the EU. Nobody is totally happy with the EU, let's face it. But there are more scenarios. Of course, we're disappointed that Madame Merkel didn't get better results, but still, there are some, there's an energy there, and I wouldn't say a kind of optimism, but certainly a will that indeed the EU goes forward, even without the UK. And that, to me, is totally underestimated here.
So that then goes, I think, to the other question of actually there's a reformist deal, there are people, there's the Eurozone, ambitions for that. The UK has never been part of that. There's a zeal to reform Europe, whether it's more Europe, some of the stuff that Monsieur Juncker put out in his speech, State of the European Union speech. The UK will be sitting there grousing, complaining, or whatever, trying to drag things back. At least there's some winces in the audience, but at least that will be the perception that the UK was always trying to say no, member states, we don't want this, we don't want that, and trying to get in the way of some of those sort of ambitious ideas. Aren't you, as the gentleman suggested, better off without us? I mean, should you not be saying, actually, if we can get this into a sensible, long-term, trade partnership, that's the sort of relationship we ought to have, a functional relationship with the UK, and then we can have our political vision for the continent. Is that not a better future for Europe?
A short answer and a long answer. The short answer is also in terms of Theresa May. Of course, in Berlin, they say how sustainable is what she's committing to now? Is she still going to be there in 2 months or 3 months? That's another hurdle and makes it even more difficult to have successful talks. But what you were asking, I mean, the short answer, of course, is no, Britain was always an asset. It was always an asset. And I remember being in Berlin just after the Brexit vote, and there was this kind of deep shock that they are gone now, and now Germany is confronted with, these French.
But that was before Macron.
Before Macron, I'm saying just in the summer 2016, and the Club Med and the Greeks, and who's left apart from the Scandinavians? So there was this very strong sense of we lost a crucial partner here, while they were always stroppy and difficult, but they had a very much broader horizon, a special partnership or relationship with the US, of course the military power. It was an asset for the European Union, seen from this point, not for European integration, but for European security, for European foreign policy. But then again, at the same time, and this has started, I think, with the Tory party and David Cameron taking the Tory MEPs out of the European group in the European Parliament, there is a constant development of turning inwards and turning away from Europe. And I think we are now at a point that there is a real split with Brexit, with everything else that's happened in this country here. You feel like they are just so navel-gazing. Why should we put so much effort into this? Let's rather move ahead and put our little energy we have into the joint projects on the continent. I mean, sorry to say that, but...
So, better off without us?
Well, I mean, the UK has always been a difficult partner, and Charles de Gaulle didn't want you at all, but that's a long time ago. But when you look at the world today, the UK is a member of NATO. It's the only European country with France to have nuclear power. There are major issues worldwide, and if we Europeans do not together see how our own values are being threatened, and our values are still common values between Mr. Putin, Mr. Trump, Mr. Erdogan, name it, however difficult the Brits may be, we'd rather have you with us.
Pablo?
I agree. I mean, I think it's an asset, and not only militarily, but also politically, culturally. I mean, in many ways. No, I think that in geopolitical terms, in the trends today in the world, it's interesting to have a wider and more, even more diverse Europe and a stronger Europe. No, yeah, I mean. Certainly, it's an asset to have the UK, and yeah. Although it's been very difficult, and I agree with Stefanie that the last years, especially since Cameron, have been very, let's say, demoralising for the Europeans. No?
Is the Commission pleased to see the back of us?
Well, I think Margareta Vestager said, "You fly a kite against the wind," and therefore constructive challenge within has actually been productive in many instances. And one shouldn't forget, if you look back over the entire 40 years, the UK has been quite instrumental in many of the major constructions. The single market was driven very much by a UK commissioner. Having said that, I also agree that more recently the kind of esteem with which my colleagues held the UK, even whilst they recognised them as the difficult customers. They nevertheless understood that the positions were well prepared, they were well argued. There was the inestimable advantage of discussions being conducted in their own language. And therefore they were very influential in developing policy and drafting and negotiating legislation. That has, I think, dissipated more recently. But I'm sure that any of my colleagues, the overwhelming majority of my colleagues, would have preferred the UK to remain a member.
Okay, let's do a couple more questions. I have one of my own if nobody asked it. So we'll just go to there, and then Lewis just down the line there. Yeah.
Nathaniel Copsey from the Foreign Office. I have just a very quick observation and then a question about finance. So the observation is that it's been very interesting to hear what you've been saying about money. If you look at the historical record, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a single example of a case where the United Kingdom has not met its financial obligations in full. We'd be very interested to hear about it. And the question is this. In Florence, the Prime Minister gave a very careful speech with beautiful, careful Treasury drafting in it. And she said a couple of things. She said some important things about money, and she said something very important about transition. I think the point on transition is very clear. On money, I'd just be very interested to know, what do you think the Prime Minister committed to in Florence, as you understand it?
Okay.
If you don't know, how can we?
He's in the Foreign Office. Foreign Office is never going to know what they committed to on money. Yes, there.
Hello, Toby Price, independent consultant. We all have a perspective in this country about what a soft Brexit looks like. I'm quite interested to know, you've all said a soft Brexit might be a good thing, but what does a soft Brexit look like to you from a European perspective?
Okay, and I'm going to throw in a... Oh, yeah, okay. One, yeah, lady in the front, sorry. Apologies. With the microphone.
Lovely. Thank you. Patricia Rawlings, House of Lords. I just wanted to pick up on some very interesting points that have been mentioned and then ask one question. Britain has always been quite difficult, and we've very, very often been divided, both parties, both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, less so obviously the Liberal. And your very good point that you made about friends in Europe and working with the Germans, which we've always worked with very closely, and other countries. And so that mustn't be forgotten, but we are divided. Coming through from the panel and from the audience a bit, it seems to be a lose-lose situation, what we're looking at. But we haven't got a written constitution, but we do have parliamentary sovereignty. And what happens when we come to the end, when we come to 2019 and the date, and the situation in England isn't quite as good as it was 3 years ago, and there's a certain amount of unemployment, and people are saying, well, actually, this isn't what we voted for in the referendum. Parliamentary sovereignty, it goes, there's a debate in Parliament, and the MPs have to represent their constituencies. But what happens then when they say, well, probably we should go back to the people? What do they think on this? Because this has been very much discounted. Everybody thinks it's going to be soft Brexit, hard Brexit, little deals, big deals. But what happens with parliamentary sovereignty when the MPs debate and vote?
Okay, thank you. And my final question was going to be, one of the things that hasn't come up at all is freedom of movement. I mean, as we understand it, one of the sort of indivisible full freedoms of the single market. But in a sense, Brexit, you could say, is in part a consequence of the UK being slightly naively uber-communautaire in the 2000s and not applying transitional controls on the A8 when the other countries did all apply transitional controls. And that's why we got a disproportionate influx from the A8. Then the Eurozone economies were performing much worse than the UK economy. So a lot of Spanish people, I worked in Spain, nobody would come to the UK if they possibly could avoid it, because it's cold and rainy and stuff, but the Spanish economy was weak enough that Spaniards even came here, Portuguese came here, things like that. And there seemed to be virtually no sympathy in the European capitals when David Cameron went and said, I need some respite on this, because otherwise this could be really, really difficult for us. And so he came away with something that during the referendum proved unsellable, and we're told that if we're going to go anything near EU, it has to be freedom of movement or whatever, and that is politically extremely difficult. But you've seen, Madame Le Pen did very well in the French elections.
Well, she didn't win.
She didn't win, but she did rather better than UKIP did. AfD did very well in Germany, which has upset the coalition situation. Spain obviously has a slightly different position on this. But I just wondered, is actually freedom of movement not something that Europe itself needs to be thinking about how it works going forward? And should there not be a bit more introspection and sympathy for a bit of the position that British have found themselves in, having miscalculated big time? I accept it's a miscalculation, but having sort of, reaped the harvest before the rest of you, and in a more dramatic way than the rest of you, of that very, very serious miscalculation. So let's go to the other questions. If the British people sort of want a referendum, what happens? What happens then? The other questions. So if you'd like to just sort of go down the line and pick up the other questions as we go down. I'm going to start go down in this order.
There were so many. But just coming back on the question of freedom of movement, and I hear this time and again, that if only Germany and if only Merkel had given Cameron more on that reform thing, and that's simply not the question, because freedom of movement, whatever you do, polls in Germany, it's not an issue for people. It's not freedom of movement. It's obviously Schengen is a big question. It's a reason why the AfD did so well as they did, and the question of refugees, and why there were so many in so little time and it couldn't be managed. But I think in Germany the sense is that you can do enough on the secondary level, which is by courts, which is, for example, limiting the access of EU foreigners to the social systems. You can do that there have been quite some stark decisions in the last years by German courts. And also now what Macron is bringing up is the question of the workers, I don't know.
The Posted Workers Directive.
Yes, exactly. So there is a lot of movement going on, and there's a lot of eagerness for reform, because there's anger, but the whole principle as such is nothing that I can see, at least in Germany, that people are unhappy with.
Do you want to just go to the point we had about, how did you read the Florence speech on money? What did you think it said about money in Germany? What was the German report on that?
I think, as I said before, it was seen like, okay, we pay until 2020 and then that's it and nothing beyond, and this is not enough. This is how it was understood in Germany. Because she said, didn't she, no one will have to pay more into the budget. But that's only the budget, and 2020 that's over. What is with the commitments beyond 2020?
Okay. So Christine, any of these points you'd like to do it? Particularly,
yes, I think
British people have a sort of existential crisis and decide that was wrong, we have another referendum and decide to go back. But after we've left, I think, on your timetable, so...
Well, again, I think we tackled that issue before. I think it would be another cataclysm, but again, it would be British parliamentary democracy at work, and it would be a British issue, and I guess the whole process would have to be upheld, but what is it that we could do? But watch and hope for the better outcome. But I'd like to also, if I may, get to your question about freedom of movement, which is, after all, one of the basic principles of the EU. What always strikes me is, after all, it's the UK and Madame Thatcher who insisted on enlargement. to prevent the deepening. You remember
Yeah,
that
no, I remember widening, not deepening. I remember that very well.
Okay. And so when there's talk in this country about migrants, it's actually Eastern Europeans having flooded to this country for all the reasons we know. When we talk about migrants, it's actually refugees or economic migrants, and that, of course, it's the whole Schengen issue. And I would also remind you, for those tempted with that marvelous Norwegian scenario, that Norway is part of Schengen. So again, it's another of those confusions, it seems to me, that freedom of movement that has been questioned with really extraordinary lies during this referendum campaign in this country, mixed this idea on your buses that, you know, Syrian refugees would invade, when actually the issue was about internal European migrations. So it's a very different perception. And again, at the forthcoming European Council, when they will talk about migrations and refugees, it won't be about Poles and even Romanians wanting to get jobs and using the freedom of movement.
So did the French government have the same view of the bill as the German government, that it was 20 billion and no more, that didn't ignore the
Yes,
honouring commitments?
absolutely. I fully subscribe to what you said.
This is a bit of failure of diplomacy here, I think, by the Foreign Office. If that's not what you wanted to hear, whatever. Message maybe to take back. Pablo, you know, on these questions around sort of freedom of movement on the bill, and on what would happen if the British people went.
So
I'm going to ask the last question.
On freedom of movement, I agree that there, I mean, I think it is an issue, but it can be handled respecting that principle. I mean, there has been a lot of, everybody who has lived here knows that there has been a lot of propaganda and misuse of the dangers of European migration, which I think are simply not true, and there's, European, and that's, it's perceived, the perception in some European countries, for Spaniards to read that they come here to claim benefits, and come on, it's really, I think that's one of the issues that's less, that's more difficult to comprehend for the Spanish people and for other EU nationals, no? And that's simply unfair, and I think that it's product of misinformation during years and of a propaganda. No? About the bill, yeah, I'm afraid I understood the same thing. There was something about honouring commitments, which is not clear at all, I think, and then there was responding to the budget commitments for the transition period, which is obvious if you want to still have access to the customs union.
Jacqueline, we were told that the language was tried out in Brussels beforehand, so surely Brussels probably did understand that, didn't they?
I think they needed more than what was in the speech, is the answer. I think there is here a kind of dissonance between two political cultures. The kind of Anglo-Saxon diplomatic culture that uses subliminal messages and says, basically, we'll see you right, trust us. And the continental and very much the EU culture, which says, we want this spelt out in detail on a piece of paper. And I think that's where the clash arose. On free movement, I would say three things. First of all, one should never underestimate the symbolic importance of free movement to countries which did not enjoy rights to move freely for a long time. Secondly, I think people in the Commission, people in the other member states looked at the expert evidence as to the benefits that free movement had brought to the UK, particularly in terms of improving the UK's GDP. And thirdly, there was a feeling that the UK did not use the tools available to it to manage that free movement in for example, channeling extra funds to areas which had experienced rapid migration, using a more contributory approach to the social security system and so on.
Okay, people are going and we're slightly running over. I just wanted to pick up for a final point this, what does soft Brexit mean to you? I had a debate on Twitter with somebody about whether Brexit in German was der Brexit or die Brexit or das Brexit. I thought it'd be das Brexit, but anyway, when I learnt German, it was apparently der Brexit. So let's talk about die Brexitin. So let's have the nice, soft, fluffy Brexit. What's the best sort of Brexit from a German point of view look like? What's this soft Brexit mean to Angela Merkel?
The soft Brexit is something like the Norway model. So not being a member anymore, but still being a member of the single market and the customs union, to avoid everything, all the administrative chaos that will be related to finding new models for the UK. Just staying in, paying for it, but obviously the problem is the European Court of Justice and freedom of movement. So it's unsolvable, I'm afraid, but that would be, from a German perspective, the best outcome.
Okay. For France?
The best outcome would be, of course, the single market and even the prospect of expanding it to services, which would be, by the way, very good for the British economy, but of course freedom of movement and of course the protection for EU citizens on either side of the channel of the European Court of Justice. So we get again into the same impasse, I'm afraid.
Pablo, la Brexita?
I would say, well, I mean, the soft Brexit would be something the more similar possible to the current situation, to the status quo. But obviously, there's a mandate from the referendum, and I think the basic mandate is some kind of limitation of freedom of movement and no loss of sovereignty. So that's quite difficult to adequate, but I'm sure it can. I mean, it's possible.
And Jacqueline?
So the only model available currently which covers services, which are so important to the British economy, is the Norway model. But that also, as has already been said, incorporates free movement of persons. I think the EEA model does to some extent address the ECJ problem, because the ECJ does not have direct authority in the Norway model, but it still leaves you with free movement. But that may be a problem which solves itself to some extent in the next 18 months. If trends reverse, that may not be seen as such a critical issue.
Yeah, no, I think that's potentially quite a lot in that. Anyway, we're going to end there, so could I ask you, could I thank you first of all for your very active participation and so many excellent questions from the audience, but could I ask you to thank our excellent panel and thank them very much for taking their time for sharing those perspectives from their capitals with us. Thank you.